It usually starts with something small. You open a streaming platform. Hundreds of shows appear on the screen. New movies, new recommendations, something trending, something everyone else seems to be watching. And yet, instead of choosing something new, you scroll past it all and return to something you've already seen, a show you finished years ago, a movie you know almost scene by scene, a series you've already watched more times than you can count. And even though you already know what happens, you press play. This is the POV of people who rewatch the same shows and movies. From the outside, it might seem strange. Why spend hours watching something when you already know the ending? Why repeat the same experience when there are thousands of new ones waiting? But for you, it's not really about watching something new. It's about returning to something familiar, because familiarity creates something the modern world rarely offers anymore: stability. Most days feel unpredictable. Conversations shift, plans change, people come and go. Life rarely follows a clear script, but a show you've already watched does. The characters stay the same. The story unfolds exactly the same way every time. The jokes land in the same places. The emotional scenes arrive exactly when you remember them. Nothing surprises you, and strangely, that predictability feels comforting. Your brain doesn't have to work as hard. When you watch something new, your mind stays alert. It tries to understand the characters, predict the plot, prepare for unexpected moments. But when you rewatch something familiar, your brain relaxes. You already know the journey, so instead of focusing on what happens next, you start noticing things you missed before. Small details in the background, a line of dialogue that suddenly feels deeper, a moment between characters that once seemed ordinary but now feels meaningful. Rewatching doesn't make the story smaller, it makes it deeper. But there's another reason you return to the same shows. Sometimes those stories are tied to certain periods of your life. A show you watched during high school, a movie you loved during a difficult year, a series you finished when life felt a little simpler. And when you return to those stories, you're not just revisiting the plot, you're revisiting a version of yourself. Our brains store memories through emotion. That means certain songs, places, or stories can bring back entire periods of life. The room where you first watched it, the people who were around you then, the version of you that existed during that time. When the opening theme starts playing, your mind quietly reconnects with those memories, and for a moment, the past feels close again. Sometimes you rewatch shows when life feels overwhelming, after a long day, during stressful weeks, when your mind feels full. Because familiar stories don't demand too much from you. They don't require full attention. They don't surprise you with intense emotional turns. They simply exist, like background comfort, something steady in the middle of chaos. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as cognitive ease. The brain naturally prefers things that feel familiar. Familiar experiences require less mental effort, less analysis, less uncertainty. That's why people replay their favorite songs, revisit the same places, or return to stories they already know. Your brain isn't being lazy, it's seeking comfort. There's also something quietly emotional about returning to the same characters. Over time, they start to feel familiar. Not like real friends, exactly, but like people whose lives you've observed closely. You've seen their struggles, their growth, their mistakes, their victories, and even though they're fictional, they feel strangely real. So when you rewatch the show, it feels like reconnecting with something known. There's also a strange paradox. The more unpredictable life becomes, the more appealing familiar stories feel. Because familiar stories remind you of emotional stability. They remind you that not everything has to be uncertain, even if it's just for an hour, even if it's just a show. Sometimes you rewatch things when you feel lonely, not because the show replaces real relationships, but because it creates presence, voices in the background, characters talking, scenes unfolding. The silence of the room feels different when something familiar is playing. it feels less empty. For many people, rewatching becomes a quiet ritual. Maybe it's the show you watch before bed, the movie you return to on quiet weekends, the series you restart every couple of years. These routines create structure, small moments that signal rest, a familiar place your mind can return to. Interestingly, the shows you rewatch often match the emotional state you need. Light-hearted comedies during stressful periods, comforting dramas during lonely ones, stories where characters support each other when life feels disconnected. Your brain quietly searches for balance, and familiar stories help restore it. But something interesting also happens when you revisit stories over time. A show you watched years ago can feel completely different now. Characters you once admired may now seem flawed. Moments you once ignored may now feel deeply meaningful, because the story stayed the same, but you changed. Your experiences changed, your perspective changed, and suddenly the story reveals something new. Sometimes you return to a show because it once helped you understand something about yourself. Stories often reflect parts of human experience we struggle to explain. They give shape to emotions. They show situations that feel familiar, and revisiting them allows you to reflect on who you were then and who you've become now. There's also something comforting about knowing how the story ends. Real life rarely offers that clarity. Conversations end without closure. Situations remain unresolved. Questions stay unanswered. But stories eventually reach resolution. And when you rewatch them, you already know that everything eventually makes sense. Some people worry that rewatching shows means they're stuck in the past, but that isn't always true. Rewatching isn't about avoiding the future. It's about preserving something meaningful. Memories, comfort, moments of emotional familiarity. In many ways, returning to familiar stories is deeply human. We return to things that once helped us feel safe. We return to things that once made us laugh. We return to things that once helped us understand life a little better. In a world that constantly pushes us toward the next thing, the next trend, the next show, the next experience, there's something quietly comforting about choosing familiarity instead, about pressing play on something you already know, about revisiting a story that once meant something to you. Because sometimes comfort doesn't come from novelty. Sometimes it comes from repetition, from familiar voices, familiar scenes, familiar emotions.